In 1945, as the Second World War lurched toward its final convulsions, someone in the Australian Military Command sat down and issued an order. Not an order to advance on a position, not an order to evacuate civilians, not even an order to stand down. The order was simpler and more deliberate than any of those. Burn the files. Destroy every record of what had been done, where it had been done, and by whom. The most audacious commando operations in the history of the Pacific War were to be erased from the institutional memory of the organization that had conceived them. And for decades, the order worked. Today, most people who can tell you about the atomic bombs and the fall of Berlin and the liberation of the Philippines cannot tell you the name Ivan Lyon. They cannot tell you what he tattooed on his chest, or why he named his final mission after it, or what his men accomplished in the darkness of a harbor they were never supposed to reach. They cannot tell you about the 10 men who were beheaded on a patch of waste ground in Singapore on the 7th of July, 1945, 39 days before the war ended. Before we go further, do you know this story? Leave a comment right now, because what you are about to discover was buried on purpose, and it deserves to be heard. To understand how 23 men could vanish into the South China Sea, and why the institution that sent them chose to erase the evidence that they had ever existed, one must first understand the catastrophe that made them necessary. The disaster did not begin with a single mistake or a cowardly decision. It began on the 15th of February, 1942, on an island that the British Empire had spent a generation calling impregnable. Singapore was not merely a military base. It was a declaration, an assertion built in concrete and steel, and the enormous guns of the naval fortress, that the British Empire was permanent, that its reach extended without interruption from London to the South China Sea, and that any power foolish enough to test that assertion would be destroyed by the weight of it. The fortress had been designed to repel an assault from the sea. Its guns faced outward toward the ocean, toward the direction from which a conventional enemy would come. What the Japanese did instead was walk down the Malay Peninsula on foot, through jungle that British military planners had rated as impassable, and arrive at the rear of the fortress before anyone had thought to defend it. On the 8th of December, 1941, the same hour that Japanese aircraft were attacking Pearl Harbor 7 time zones to the east, Japan invaded Malaya. 68 days later, the largest British military surrender in history was complete. 80,000 Allied troops laid down their weapons. Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. The fortress had not fallen to superior firepower, it had fallen to superior thinking. And every officer who survived the chaos of those final weeks understood something that no official dispatch would ever quite articulate. The war in the Pacific had rewritten its own rules, and the British Empire had not yet read the new ones. Within the chaos of those final days, the smoke and the desperate improvisation of a city being abandoned, a British captain named Ivan Lyon was doing something that would prove more consequential than any of the battles being fought around him. He was organizing civilian evacuations by commandeered small boats, loading women and children onto anything that floated, and pushing it out into the harbor under Japanese artillery fire. Lyon was 26 years old, commissioned out of Sandhurst into the Gordon Highlanders, posted to Singapore in 1936. He was the second son of a brigadier general, the grandson of a colonel who had fought in the Indian Mutiny. Military service was not a career he had chosen so much as a tradition he had been born into. What he carried that was entirely his own was a stubbornness that bordered on the pathological, a refusal to accept that any situation was as finished as it appeared. His commanding officers had recognized it. His subordinates had learned to trust it. What it would cost him personally was something that no one who knew him in those years could have predicted. He was also carrying something that no military tradition could have prepared him for, Somewhere in the internment system that was already swallowing the city's civilian population, his wife and his infant son had already been lost. Gabrielle Lyon, born Bouvier, daughter of the French prison governor of Pulo Condore Island in Indochina, married to Ivan in Saigon in July of 1939, had been attempting to escape Singapore with their son Clive when the ship they were on was intercepted by a German surface raider. She and the boy were now prisoners. Ivan Lyon went to war knowing that his family was held by the empire he was fighting. He pushed the civilian boats out into the harbor, watched the city burn behind him, and locked that knowledge somewhere deep where it could not interfere with what needed to be done. That the knowledge never entirely went away, that it surfaced in quiet moments and in the specific intensity with which he pursued every plan that involved going back to Singapore, was something only the men closest to him ever observed directly. During those final hours in the harbor, his small boat nearly collided in the darkness with a 70-foot Japanese-built fishing vessel commanded by a 61-year-old Australian civilian named Bill Reynolds. Reynolds had been using the boat, the Kofuku Maru, which meant happy ship in Japanese, to evacuate refugees from the outlying islands. Two men, one a British captain in his 20s, and one an elderly Australian civilian, were doing the same thing by different means, in the same burning harbor, on the same desperate night. They spoke briefly. They exchanged enough information to recognize each other as allies. They went their separate ways into the darkness. Neither of them could have known that their meeting in that harbor would produce the longest, most devastating, and ultimately most tragic commando operation in the history of the Pacific War. Lyon escaped Singapore on a stolen Japanese motor sampan, navigated the treacherous currents of the Singapore Strait with his Batman Corporal Ronald Morris, reached Sumatra, and eventually made his way through a series of increasingly dangerous island crossings to Australia. He arrived not as a refugee or a defeated officer, but as a man with a plan. Not a plan for ordinary warfare, not a plan for the kind of conventional engagement that the military apparatus around him was designed to conduct. A plan for something that had never been attempted, a clandestine attack launched from the Australian continent against the most heavily guarded harbor in Southeast Asia. He proposed it to the right people, who took it to the right people above them, and the machinery of what would become Z Special Unit began its slow, secret revolution. The organization that would authorize Lyon's plan operated under a secrecy so extreme that it had become a kind of institutional pathology. It ran through multiple cover names: Inter-Allied Services Department, then Special Operations Australia, then Services Reconnaissance Department, each change designed to confuse anyone attempting to trace its activities, including eventually its own veterans. It was authorized by Prime Minister John Curtin in March of 1942, its existence known only to the Prime Minister and the highest command. The Commando arm, designated Z Special Unit, appeared on the service records of every Australian Army soldier assigned to its operations, which meant that men who survived the war spent decades gathering in veterans associations under a name that was not the name of the organization they had actually served in. The secrecy was so complete and so deliberately maintained that it outlasted the war itself. Veterans believed they had served in one organization when they had served in another. The confusion was not accidental. It was the residue of a secrecy architecture built to survive. They trained in places chosen for their impossibility of access and their distance from curious eyes. Refuge Bay on the Hawkesbury River in New South Wales, where the cliffs above the water made observation from the outside impossible, and the remoteness guaranteed that what was being practiced there would remain between the cliffs and the water. The Zed Experimental Station near Cairns, a large hickory and cedar mansion on a hillside that locals called the House on the Hill, which served as a wireless relay station and training ground simultaneously. Fraser Island in Queensland, which became a full commando school once the scale of operations expanded beyond what any existing facility could accommodate. The men who passed through these places learned demolitions, jungle craft, boat handling, unarmed combat, Malay language, and the particular discipline of operating for extended periods inside enemy territory without any external support. They learned things that were not in any manual the Australian Army had written, because the Australian Army had never been asked to do what these men were being asked to do. At the Zed experimental station, when the organization that had built it was dissolved and restructured in the constantly shifting bureaucratic landscape of wartime special operations, orders were issued to destroy all records relating to its activities at that facility. This was not panic or improvisation. It was deliberate institutional policy, practiced across multiple sites, carried out with the methodical thoroughness that the men who issued such orders had been trained to apply to everything they did. The erasure of what these men had done began before they had finished doing it. That is the first thing to understand about the story that follows. The people who sent these men also built the mechanism for forgetting them. Lyon had traveled to Britain in the early months of 1944 to examine a classified weapon that no one in Australia had yet seen in operation. The Special Operations Executive had developed it over years of classified research, and its operators called it, with the affectionate irreverence of men who work with dangerous things, the Sleeping Beauty. Standing in a British workshop, Lyon watched a man in a rubber diving suit stretch out prone in the cockpit of a 13-foot electric craft and disappear beneath the surface of the water. Silently, completely, without a ripple that would betray him to anyone watching from a ship's rail above. He rose briefly to the surface after several minutes, checked his bearing with an underwater compass, and went under again. The technique the operators called porpoising. Lyon stood in that workshop and understood, in the specific way that a man understands something he has been building toward for years, what he was looking at. The weapon that would let him go back to Singapore on his own terms. Before he ever held one in his hands, however, he had already proved that the concept was sound. What happened in the waters around Singapore in the final days of September 1943 was not merely a military success. It was a demonstration, delivered at enormous personal risk by 14 men in a fishing boat, that the empire of the fortress had a seam, and that seam could be split open by men willing to paddle canvas-full boats into the dark. The crate, the boat that Reynolds had provided and Lyon had renamed after the small but deadly Asian snake, left Exmouth Gulf in Western Australia on the 1st of September, 1943. It carried 3 British and 11 Australian personnel, a crew small enough to fit in a single room and determined enough to sail nearly 4,000 kilometers into Japanese-controlled waters disguised as Indonesian fishermen. They stained their skin brown with dye. They wore sarongs. They disposed of every piece of rubbish with obsessive care, understanding that a cigarette wrapper from an American brand or a tin with an English label floating in the Java Sea could betray them as surely as a radio transmission. During the voyage, they suffered a force 9 gale that nearly sank the vessel, a snapped propeller shaft that required emergency repair by a passing American submarine, whose crew must have found the situation approximately as improbable as it was, and weeks of grinding tension maintained against the knowledge that every Japanese vessel they passed could end everything with a single radio call. The crate continued north. On the 24th of September, the boat arrived off Singapore. That night, 6 men, Lyon, Davidson, Page, Falls, Jones, and Houston, left the crate and paddled 50 kilometers in 3 two-man full boats to a cave on a small island near the harbor. The remaining 8 stayed aboard the vessel and waited. The 6 men in the cave rationed their food, watched the harbor traffic through binoculars, and committed the geography to memory with the patient precision of men who understood that the difference between correct information and incorrect information in a Japanese patrolled harbor after midnight was the difference between returning to Australia and not returning at all. They waited 2 days. Then they went in. On the night of the 25th of September, the 3 full boats moved into Singapore harbor. They moved in practiced silence, slipping between the hulls of vessels at anchor, reading the harbor's geography by feel and by memory. What they carried were limpet mines, magnetic explosives with delayed fuses set for 2 to 3 hours after attachment. The technique required approaching the target hull in darkness, placing the mine against the steel below the waterline, where the detonation would cause maximum structural damage, and paddling to the next target without making a sound that would carry across the water to the nearest sentry. No firefight, no dramatic confrontation with a guard, only the darkness and the water and the weight of the mines and the sounds of a working harbor at night, the creak of mooring lines, the slap of small waves against steel, the distant conversation of men who had no idea they were being visited by enemies in canvas boats. The mines detonated at dawn on the 26th of September. Allied intelligence initially reported 7 ships sunk, totaling approximately 37,000 tons of shipping, a figure that the fog of war and the enthusiasm of officers composing reports had inflated beyond the documented reality. Japanese records, examined with forensic care after the surrender, establish a more precise accounting. 6 ships were hit, 2 permanently destroyed. The Hakusan Maru at 2,197 tons, and the Kizan Maru at 5,071 tons. 3 others damaged, but subsequently repaired and returned to service. The strategic impact of these numbers was real, but modest. The psychological impact on the Allied command, the proof that Singapore harbor could be penetrated from Australian waters by a handful of men in a fishing boat, was enormous and entirely out of proportion to the tonnage of the ships that sank. The Japanese in Singapore were stunned not by the damage, but by its inexplicability. They could not conceive that the attack had been mounted from Australia. The distance was too great, the audacity too extreme, the proposition that a fishing boat had sailed undetected through the heart of the Japanese Empire and deposited raiders in Keppel Harbor, too fundamentally absurd to be taken seriously by men trained in conventional military logic. They concluded instead that local saboteurs were responsible, most likely pro-communist Chinese guerrillas operating with British encouragement, from inside the civilian population. On the 10th of October, 1943, a date that Singaporeans know as the Double 10th, the Kempei Tai, the Japanese military police, raided Changi prison and arrested 57 civilian internees. At the same time, more than 250 civilians across the island were detained for questioning. European internees and ethnic Chinese suspected of resistance connections were taken to the former YMCA building on Orchard Road, which had been converted into Kempei Tai interrogation chambers. What followed there over the subsequent weeks was systematic torture on a scale that the post-war trials would document in specific and horrifying detail. Beatings with fists and rubber hoses, waterboarding that left men unable to breathe without pain for weeks afterward, electrical shocks, starvation used as a softening mechanism between interrogation sessions, mock executions carried out with sufficient realism that some prisoners believed they were about to die before being returned to their cells. At least 50 people died during interrogation or by summary execution. None of them had any knowledge of Operation Jaywick, because none of them had any involvement in it. They were being systematically destroyed for something they did not do, by an enemy that had been given no reason to suspect the truth. The Allies in Australia knew this was happening. They said nothing. The official position was to allow the Japanese to maintain their false belief in local saboteurs, primarily because claiming responsibility would expose the secret of the crate and eliminate any possibility of using the vessel for future operations. The logic was military and institutional, and, by its own internal arithmetic, coherent. A boat and its proven infiltration capacity was worth more, in that calculation, than the lives of the people dying in the former YMCA. This was not a decision made in ignorance or haste. It was a calculated institutional choice, deliberate and documented, and it established a pattern that would be repeated with increasing cost in the months ahead. On the 19th of October, 1943, the crate arrived back at Exmouth Gulf in Western Australia. 48 days, nearly 4,000 kilometers of enemy-controlled ocean. Every man alive. The celebration photographs from the weeks that followed capture something that formal military portraits rarely achieve: the specific relief of men who understood precisely what they had risked and had come back from it intact. In those photographs, Ivan Lyon is 28 years old. His wife and his infant son are in Japanese internment, somewhere in the system that has swallowed thousands of civilians across Southeast Asia. He's raising a beer in Queensland, while the empire that holds his family is being mocked in newspapers across the Allied world. The thing that allowed him to raise that glass was not callousness toward what Gabrielle and Clive were enduring. It was the certainty that the proof of concept was now established, that the weapon waiting in a British workshop would make the next operation incomparably greater, and that the next operation would happen because Ivan Lyon would not allow it not to happen. The tattoo on his chest was a tiger, large, multicolored, occupying the full expanse of his torso. He had acquired it years before the war, during his years of sailing around Southeast Asia, and it said something about him that his service record could not quite capture. In Malay, the word for tiger is Rimau. When Lyon began designing the follow-up to Jaywick in the early weeks of 1944, fresh from his trip to Britain and the silent electric craft that had disappeared beneath the surface of a workshop pool, he named the new operation accordingly. Not Operation Tiger, which would have been too direct, too easily decoded by any enemy intelligence officer who intercepted a communication. Rimau, a name that carried the same meaning in a language that required translation, that meant exactly what the tattoo meant. This is not a creature that retreats from anything. The operation he designed bore almost no resemblance to what had come before, except in its ultimate target. Where Jaywick had sent 6 men and canvas full boats into the harbor to mine whatever ships they could reach with what they could carry, Rimau proposed to send 23 men equipped with 15 Sleeping Beauties, the motorized submersible canoes that Lyon had watched disappear beneath British water, into position to attack 60 ships simultaneously. 30 to be sunk, 30 to be damaged. The Sleeping Beauties that would deliver the mines had technical specifications that demanded weeks of training to master. 4.5 knots on the surface, 3.5 knots submerged, a range of 50 kilometers on a fully charged battery, 9 limpet mines per unit sufficient to sink 2 10,000-ton ships if the placements were correct. The pilot lay prone in the cockpit in a rubber diving suit, controlling the craft with a joystick, navigating with an underwater compass, rising briefly to the surface at intervals to check his position before diving again. It was the most sophisticated delivery system for maritime sabotage that the Allied nations had developed, and Lyon had personally traveled across the world to evaluate it. He recorded his own assessment in the official planning documents. The operation was, in his own words, too big. His misgivings were documented. The institutional momentum of the success at Jaywick, the ambition of the planners above him, and his own refusal to abandon the target that had consumed him since the fall of Singapore, combined to override whatever caution his judgment was still capable of producing. When something has worked once, the pressure to attempt it again at greater scale is a force that military institutions have never learned to resist effectively. 60 volunteers were selected in July of 1944, culled to 32 through a selection process at Potshot near Exmouth, then reduced further to the final 23 who would actually go. Among them were men whose names deserve to be said aloud. Major Reginald Ingleton of the Royal Marines, a Londoner who had crossed the world to find action in this war and had attached himself to the Rimau team almost accidentally, initially designated as an observer before the nature of the operation made that designation meaningless. Captain Robert Page, 24 years old and newly married, a veteran of the Jaywick raid, who understood precisely what he was volunteering for and volunteered anyway. Sergeant Colin Cameron, 21 years old. Able Seaman Frederick Marsh and Able Seaman Andrew Houston, both 20 years old. Albert Sargent, whom everyone who served with him called Blondie, was 25 years old and had already fought in North Africa and in Syria before finding his way to Z's special unit. He had accumulated more combat experience than men a decade older, and he chose with full deliberate knowledge to accumulate more. There was also the matter of what this operation was sailing into. The Jaywick raid had not merely damaged Japanese shipping, it had alarmed the Japanese command sufficiently to trigger a comprehensive review and upgrade of Singapore Harbour's security apparatus. More patrols, more scrutiny of maritime traffic, greater awareness among harbour authorities of the possibility that a disguised vessel could penetrate the outer perimeter. The success of the first raid had informed the defenses that the second raid would now have to penetrate. This is the mathematics that ambition imposes on itself. Each proof of concept raises the cost of the next attempt, and the men who plan the next attempt are often the men most certain that the proof applies to them. On the 11th of September, 1944, 23 men boarded HMS Porpoise, a British mine-laying submarine, at Careening Bay near Fremantle in Western Australia, and departed for enemy waters. The Porpoise would deliver them to Marapis Island, 110 kilometers southeast of Singapore, where they would transfer to a captured local junk, sail toward the harbor disguised as Malay traders, and from a position near Labuan Island, launch 15 Sleeping Beauties simultaneously into the dark water, towards 60 targets in Keppel Harbor. After the attack, they would scuttle both the junk and the submersibles, return to Marapis by full boat, and be extracted by submarine between the 7th of November and the 7th of December. That was the plan. Apart from the Japanese and a handful of local people in the islands of the Rimau archipelago, no one ever saw the 23 men again. The first complication arrived before the mission had properly started. Marapis Island, described in planning documents as uninhabited and therefore suitable as a forward base, was found to be inhabited when the Porpoise arrived. To prevent the team's stores from being discovered by the islanders, Lieutenant Walter Carey was left behind as a caretaker. Carey was supposed to be part of the operational team. He spent the mission guarding rice and ammunition on a small island in the Rimau archipelago, while his colleagues went forward without him. The gap between the plan and the reality of an operation conducted in enemy territory had opened before the Porpoise had even departed. The Commandos commandeered a Malay junk named the Mustika from local fishermen in the waters near Marapis, loaded their equipment aboard, and sailed toward Singapore with the Malay crew sequestered on the submarine and eventually transported to Fremantle, where they remained for the duration of the war. The Rimau men wore sarongs. They had stained their skin. They maintained the fiction of an innocent trading junk moving through familiar waters. For 4 days, the approach held without incident. Then, on the 10th of October, 1944, 2 hours before sunset, 1 hour before the raid was scheduled to begin, everything collapsed. A patrol boat from the Malay Heiho, the Japanese organized auxiliary force, approached and challenged the Mustika. Someone on board the Mustika fired. 3 Malays on the patrol boat were killed. 2 escaped overboard and swam toward shore. Lyon understood, in the seconds between the shooting and the silence that followed it, that those 2 survivors swimming toward the nearest island were carrying enough information to bring the entire Japanese garrison of the region down on his position within hours. The mission as originally planned was finished in that moment. What he did next was the decision that would define not just the operation, but the historical assessment of the man. He ordered the Mustika destroyed with explosive charges. He ordered all 15 Sleeping Beauties, the top-secret craft that had been trained on for months and across thousands of kilometers, that represented the most advanced maritime sabotage technology in the Allied inventory, scuttled in enemy waters. He divided his 23 men into 4 groups and gave 3 of them orders to make their way back to Marapas Island to await the rescue submarine. Then he took 7 men, the full boats that had been stored on the Mustika, and the limpet mines, and paddled towards Singapore Harbour anyway. No Sleeping Beauties. No plan that anyone at Special Operations Australia in Melbourne had approved. A Japanese garrison that was at that moment beginning to respond to reports from the 2 men who had swum ashore. And somewhere in that harbor, ships that would not be destroyed unless someone with the willingness to try destroyed them. They are believed to have sunk 3 ships. A Japanese naval signal intercepted by Allied codebreakers in the days that followed mentioned 3 unexplained wrecks on the Admiralty charts near Singapore Harbour. The evidence is not conclusive. What is certain is that 7 men paddled into a harbour that was already on alert, attached mines to ships in the dark, and paddled back out again. In the context of everything that was about to happen, 3 unexplained wrecks may seem a diminished return. In the context of what Ivan Lyon was and what drove him there, 3 unexplained wrecks was precisely the kind of answer he had always given to impossible situations. In Australia, the codebreakers were reading the Japanese transmissions. The day after the Mustika encounter, an intercepted signal reported approximately 20 Caucasians engaged in a defensive stand in the Rimau archipelago. The officials who received and decoded this signal understood exactly what it meant. They knew that Operation Rimau had been compromised, that the Commandos were in serious difficulty, that the rescue submarine would need to be redirected to the area with some urgency if any of the men were to survive. They did nothing. To act on the information would have revealed to the Japanese that their military codes had been broken, and the Allied cryptographic advantage was considered too strategically valuable to risk for any individual operation or any collection of individuals, regardless of their circumstances. The men in the Rimau archipelago were weighed against the intelligence advantage represented by broken Japanese codes. The intelligence advantage was judged to outweigh the men. This was the second institutional betrayal in a sequence that had begun with the record destruction at the Z experimental station and would end with the files that were burning in August of 1945. On the 15th of October, Lyon's group was located on Sore Island by a Japanese force estimated at between 80 and 90 soldiers. Lieutenant Commander Davidson and Corporal Campbell were wounded early in the engagement, seriously enough that their capacity to sustain the fight was compromised. Lyon made the decision that the situation required. Davidson and Campbell would take a full boat and paddle to the nearby island of Tapai, where other members of the party were believed to be. Lyon, Lieutenant Ross, and Corporal Stewart would hold the Japanese at Sore long enough for the full boat to clear the island. Lyon and Ross climbed into the palm trees on the western side of Sore Island. From that elevated position, using the cover of the canopy and the field of fire that height provided over the landing area, they held a force more than 12 times their number at bay for 9 hours. The arithmetic of what that means in practice 2 men sustaining fire for 9 hours against 80 requires a moment to comprehend fully. Then grenades were thrown into the canopy. Ivan Lyon, Lieutenant Colonel, Gordon Highlanders, commanding officer of the most ambitious special operations in the history of the Pacific War, the man whose chest bore the tiger that had named the mission that killed him, died on the 16th of October, 1944. He was 29 years old. His wife, Gabriel, was in Japanese internment. His son, Clive, was 3 years old, and growing up without a father on the wrong side of a war that was already, by October of 1944, tilting irreversibly toward Allied victory. He died buying time for 2 wounded men to paddle away from an island. Every promise the tiger tattoo had ever made, he had kept. Davidson and Campbell reached Tapai Island. They had 1 pistol, 1 hand grenade, severe wounds to their upper bodies, and the knowledge that the Japanese would find them within hours. They sat upright, side by side, and took their potassium cyanide capsules. Their bodies were found the next day in the same position. The report that documented the discovery used the phrase "sitting upright," and there is something in those 2 words that resists moving past without acknowledgement. Of the survivors scattered across the island chain, 18 gathered on Marapis Island by the 4th of November. 2 more died in combat when a Japanese landing party reached the island, Riggs and Cameron, killed in the firefight, their bodies remaining in that ground undiscovered and unidentified until 1994. The remaining men dispersed to nearby islands and organized themselves around the only coherent plan available to them. Maintain the lookout rotation that Page established, 2 men watching the water from dusk to dawn, every night, waiting for the submarine that the operational order promised would appear on the 7th of November. On the 7th of November, 1944, 10 commandos were in the correct position at the correct beach at the correct time. HMS Tantalus, under Lieutenant Commander Hugh Mackenzie, did not appear. Mackenzie was a decorated and aggressive submarine commander whose professional identity was built around hunting enemy shipping. He had torpedoes, he had fuel, and he regarded the assignment to extract a group of commandos from an Indonesian island as an interruption of the purpose for which he and his vessel had been designed. He cited discretionary language in his written orders. The more direct description of what happened on the 7th of November, 1944, is that 10 men waited on a beach in enemy territory, and the submarine that was supposed to collect them chose to hunt ships instead. On the 21st of November, the Tantalus arrived at Marapis, on the wrong side of the island, against the standing orders that specified the northern approach. A shore party, including Major Chapman and Corporal Croton, went ashore. When Chapman attempted to turn back to the submarine, Croton drew his pistol and forced him to continue to the designated meeting point. They arrived after dawn. The campfire had half-cooked food still in the pot. The men had been at that location within the last few hours and had fled when the approaching shore party was mistaken for a Japanese landing. HMS Tantalus departed. The submarine was not ordered to return, and it did not return on its own initiative. The men were left. On the 7th of December, 1944, the final rescue deadline expired. Captain Page looked at the empty water and understood. The men pushed their full boats into the sea and began paddling south toward the Australian coast, 3,000 kilometers away, through an archipelago that Japanese forces were systematically searching. Warrant Officer Jeffrey Willersdorf and Lance Corporal Hugo Pace paddled for weeks across open ocean, stopping at islands along the route to find food and water, navigating by stars toward a landmass they could not see. They reached Romang Island on the 17th of January, 1945. They were 600 kilometers from Darwin, with the Timor Sea between them and the Australian coast, after a journey of approximately 2,000 kilometers by full boat. A local village chief reported their presence to the Japanese authorities. Villersdorf was captured and transported to Dili in Portuguese Timor, where he was tortured and left in a cell to die of his wounds. He died in March of 1945. Poss died of starvation in the same facility in June. The submarine HMS Porpoise, which had delivered all 23 men to the beginning of this sequence of events, was sunk by Japanese aircraft in January of 1945. 44 men of the Porpoise's crew were lost in that sinking, adding one more accounting to the total cost of Operation Rimau. Private Douglas Warren recovered from a fever-induced delirium that had incapacitated him for days, commandeered a small local boat, and spent weeks hiding among the islands whenever Japanese patrols came near. The Japanese knew he was somewhere in the archipelago. They were looking for him specifically. He evaded capture until March of 1945, longer than any other surviving member of the Rimau party, before being taken to Surabaya in Java. The ferocity with which the Japanese responded to yet another captured Rimau operative expressed itself in treatment from which he could not recover. He died in April of 1945, either from the accumulated effect of his wounds and his captivity, or, according to some accounts that emerged in post-war investigations, after being used as a subject in an anti-tetanus experiment conducted at the Naval Hospital. He was 24 years old. Able seaman Frederick Marsh died on the 1st of February, 1945, in Japanese custody at Tanjung Pagar in Singapore. The causes were malaria compounded by the wounds he had sustained during the operational phase of Rimau. He was 20 years old. He had spent months training on the Sleeping Beauties, had paddled through Japanese patrols in darkness, had survived the catastrophic compromise of the mission and the scattered island existence that followed, had endured the weeks of open ocean paddling and the knowledge that the rescue submarine wasn't coming, and had finally been captured and brought to a city he had twice approached as an enemy. He died there of a fever and wounds that adequate medical care would have treated without difficulty. By March of 1945, the 10 men who remained alive in Japanese custody had been assembled at Outram Road Prison in Singapore. The prison occupied a specific place in the knowledge of Allied prisoners of war across the region, a facility where guards used the prisoner population as practice equipment for jiu-jitsu training, where the daily food ration was 500 grams of rice, where beriberi, scabies, malaria, and dysentery operated without obstruction in conditions that the facility's administrators made no effort to improve. When the Japanese discovered that several of the Rimau prisoners had also participated in Operation Jaywick, the raid that had triggered the torture and deaths of hundreds of civilians in Singapore in October of 1943, the response was a specific intensification of what they were already experiencing. These were men who had attacked Singapore before and returned to attack it again. The institutional response to that fact was physical and daily, and documented in the testimony of survivors from other parts of the prison who witnessed it. On the 3rd of July, 1945, the 10 men were placed on trial on charges of perfidy and espionage before a military court presided over by Colonel Masayoshi Toatari, with Judicial Major Mitsuo Jifiku and Major Miyoshi Hasada. The proceedings offered no defense lawyers. The translations provided to the accused were inadequate. The confessions that formed the primary basis of the prosecution's case had been obtained during months of interrogation, conducted in conditions that rendered genuine consent an abstract concept. The legal argument at the center of the charges, that the men had fought while disguised as civilians, and that this constituted perfidy under the laws of war, was a construction designed to reach a conclusion that had been settled before the trial began. Everyone in the courtroom understood this. The men in the dock understood it. The judges delivering the verdict understood it. What makes the verdict of the 3rd of July, 1945, genuinely extraordinary, beyond the predictable outrage of a proceeding built backward from a predetermined sentence, is what the judges chose to include alongside the death sentence in their formal statement. They praised the bravery of the men they were executing. They acknowledged explicitly that the condemned had conducted themselves as warriors of exceptional courage, in accordance with the highest traditions of military service. The men who had decided these prisoners would die before the first word of evidence was presented, who knew the confessions were the product of coercion, who had assembled a legal framework for the sole purpose of justifying an execution, could not bring themselves to deny what was plainly true about the men kneeling before them. The enemy's involuntary acknowledgement of who these men actually were is the only honest document produced by the entire proceeding. It is also the most damning indictment of the institution that ordered the execution. On the 7th of July, 1945, the 10 men were taken from Outram Road Prison to a patch of waste ground near what is now the intersection of Clementi and Dover Roads in Singapore. They were made to dig their own graves. The accounts gathered by post-war investigators from witnesses who were present describe what followed as a composed farewell. Men who had been through everything, that captivity and torture and the sustained failure of every institution that should have protected them could produce, saying goodbye to each other with a steadiness that the witnesses found impossible to attribute to anything except the fundamental character of the men themselves. Then they knelt. The executions, according to the evidence presented by a Royal Army Medical Corps officer who examined the bodies in the months after the surrender, took more than half an hour to complete. On some occasions, 2 or 3 blows were required. The bodies were placed in 3 unmarked graves. 7th of July, 1945. The Allied advance across the Pacific had proceeded to a point where the outcome of the war was not in serious military doubt among anyone with access to the relevant information. The atomic bomb would fall on Hiroshima 30 days later, on the 6th of August. Japan announced its surrender on the 15th of August. The 10 men on Dover Road had been dead for 39 days when the war they had dedicated and ultimately given everything to win finally reached its conclusion. 39 days. Sit with that number. When Australian war crimes investigators reached Singapore in the months after the surrender, they located the graves and sought prosecution of the judges and executioners responsible for the deaths on Dover Road. The advice they received from the British War Crimes Command was precise and devastating in its implications. When a person had been tried and convicted under Japanese law, neither the court that convicted them nor the executioner who carried out the sentence could be regarded as a war criminal under the applicable legal standards, and no hard and fast rule could be established as to what constitutes a fair trial. The men who had killed 10 Allied commandos in a proceeding where the verdict was determined before the evidence was assembled faced no specific legal accountability for those deaths. General Seishiro Itagaki, the 7th Area Army commander, who had insisted on the execution against the views of those within the Japanese command, who might have proceeded differently, was subsequently tried by a separate tribunal, convicted, and hanged for other crimes committed in other contexts. For the specific deaths on Dover Road, there was official advice about the difficulty of establishing hard and fast rules, and then there was institutional silence. The files were burning. At the Zed Experimental Station and at other facilities across the Special Operations Australia network, the orders that had been issued during the various reorganizations and dissolutions of the wartime period were being carried out. Burn the records. Remove the documentation of what had been done, who had done it, and what had happened to them afterward. The veterans who returned and attempted to gather in the post-war years found themselves uncertain of the name of the organization they had served. The West Australian Association they formed called itself the Services Reconnaissance Department Association because its members believed, based on what they had been told while serving, that this was the correct designation for what they had been part of. The confusion was the direct product of the secrecy architecture that had been built deliberately and maintained beyond the point where it served any security purpose, well into the years when it served only the purpose of institutional self-protection. The double tenth remained unacknowledged in any official statement. The innocent civilians who had been tortured and killed in Singapore in October of 1943 because the Allies had chosen to protect the secret of the crate over claiming responsibility for the Jaywick attack, received no formal acknowledgement from the institution whose operation had triggered their suffering. The moral debt that the men of Rimau deserved to have repaid was equally owed to Elizabeth Choi and to the others who had passed through the former YMCA building on Orchard Road, and it was owed to them for the same reason. An institution had made a calculation in which human lives were the currency, and the institution's continued operational capacity was the purchase. Neither reckoning came. What broke through the erasure was the kind of individual persistence that institutional architectures of forgetting are not built to withstand indefinitely. A researcher named Lynette Silver spent more than 30 years working through Japanese military records, Allied archival materials, Dutch East Indies colonial records, and the first-hand testimony of Indonesian and Malay witnesses who had been alive in the Riau archipelago in 1944 and retained specific memories of what they had seen. Silver located the execution site through a process of documentary and physical investigation that combined archival research with on-the-ground inquiry in Singapore. In 1992, she presented her findings to an Australian living in Singapore, who engaged an elderly Chinese man who had lived near Dover Road for decades and knew the land behind the former golf clubhouse with the intimacy of long neighborhood familiarity. Together, they isolated the killing ground to a specific patch of fenced land. Silver then spent 19 years pressing for official recognition of the site before a historic marker was erected near the intersection of Clementi and Dover Roads in 2012. 67 years after the men whose deaths it commemorates were killed in the dirt 20 meters from where the stone was placed. Major Tom Hall spent 31 years establishing the documented fate of every individual member of the Rimau Party, not as a collective accounting, but as individual cases, person by person, until no member of the 23 remained unaccounted for. The skull of Sergeant Colin Cameron, killed on Maripus Island on the 5th of November, 1944, was forensically identified in 1994, 50 years after his death, on an island in the Riau archipelago. Bill Reynolds, Lyon's original partner from the burning harbor of 1942, had been captured in a separate operation in Borneo and held at Balikpapan prison. He scratched messages about himself into the wall of his cell, leaving a record in stone because he could not be confident that any other record would survive him. Members of the Australian 7th Division discovered the inscriptions in August of 1945 and removed the section of wall on which they were written. It is preserved at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It can be seen today by anyone who chooses to look. The crate is moored at the Australian National Maritime Museum in Darling Harbour in Sydney. The same hull, the same vessel that carried 14 men nearly 4,000 kilometers into the Japanese Empire and returned every one of them safely to Australian waters. Anyone who wishes to see it can do so. Most people who walk past it do not know what they are walking past, which is precisely the outcome that the institutional order to burn the files was designed to produce. At Kranji War Cemetery in Singapore, 19 of the 23 Rimau men are buried. The memorial plaque placed there by former Z Special Unit members in 1995 says, "We salute their daring and bravery. The records that were burned to ensure that no one would ever have reason to say those words about these men were not, in the final accounting, burned thoroughly enough. Gabrielle Lyon remained a widow for 34 years, dying in 1978 without having seen adequate public recognition of what her husband had done and what his men had endured. Her son Clive followed his father into the Gordon Highlanders and served in Borneo in 1965 and 1966. The military lineage continued into the next generation. The cost of that lineage had already been established in full, and the establishment of it had never been properly acknowledged by the institution that extracted it. The burned files were not protecting classified intelligence in any operationally meaningful sense by August of 1945. The war was over. The enemy had surrendered. What the burned files were protecting was the institution's ability to present itself in the years that followed, without the obligation to account for the decisions it had made. The men of Rimau were expendable at 3 separate moments: when the broken Japanese code was withheld from the rescue submarine because the code was worth more than the men, when the rescue submarine chose to hunt enemy ships rather than appear at the agreed rendezvous, and when the documentation of the entire sequence was committed to fire so that the question of accountability could not arise in any formal context. The calculation that produced each of these decisions was internally coherent. Measured against what happened on Dover Road on the 7th of July, 1945, the calculation was wrong in a way that no institutional logic can redeem. What cannot be categorized by institutional logic, what resists every framework that military organizations apply to the human beings who serve them, is simpler than any of that. The 10 men dug their own graves. The judges who sentenced them to death praised their courage in the same breath, and 39 days later, the war ended. That number, 39, is the last word this story has to offer, the precise measurement of how close these men came to a world in which none of this would have been necessary, and how completely the institution that sent them there failed to close the distance. If this story has moved you, do one thing before you go. Pick one name from the list of the 10 men who were killed on Dover Road. Not Lyon. He has his memorials and his measure of recorded recognition. Pick one of the others: Sergeant David Gooley, Lance Corporal John Hardy, Corporal Roland Fletcher. Say the name out loud, once, clearly, to no one in particular. It costs nothing. After everything that was spent to erase these men from the record, after everything the institution burned and buried and declined to acknowledge, saying a name is the smallest possible act of refusal. It is also, after everything, exactly what they deserve. Subscribe, because the next story we tell was also buried. They all were.